Morning. Welcome to the online Sunday school lesson from Malden First Baptist Church in Malden, South Carolina. I'm Barry Ray. Hope you have had a good week and are ready to learn a little bit more from the New Testament as we continue to study the writings of the Apostle Paul. This is our final lesson in this particular groups of lesson. We'll continue on with the theme of the early church as we go forward. But if you are in possession of the literature we use, you'll notice that this is the last lesson of this particular book. Now, as the final lesson in this series, we've been talking about the early church and the problems that the early church faced as the apostles, and more specifically, the Apostle Paul, navigated the difficult and often treacherous road to establishing a church that would eventually change the world. Distractions, roadblocks arose that threatened to steer many of the churches away from their mission. One of the reasons why these letters of Paul to these churches are so, I think, informative and inspirational to us is that the early churches were not the only ones that faced these issues. We face the same issues in our world today. It didn't take Paul long to realize that Satan was actively attacking in the early church. He knew the gospel would attract enemies. After all, he himself was perhaps the biggest enemy the early church had prior to his conversion in the early days when he was attacking people on behalf of Rome. The dangers faced by these early Christians still exist. For that reason, the advice and encouragement that he gave early Christians help us today as we seek to be followers of Jesus in a world that is often against him and us. We've all seen people who seem determined to get hurt, whereas most of us try to stay as far away from this type of activity as possible. Others seem drawn to death-defying feats. You can only watch television for 5 or 6 minutes and you'll see someone taking their lives into their hands for entertainment. As crazy as this particular person you see may seem to us, we fail to see more subtle dangers that creep into our lives. Too often we end up in a crisis of our own making, wondering, how did I get here? The early churches, despite their zeal for the gospel, were vulnerable too. They welcomed false teachers into their pulpits. They allowed the hedonistic practices of the world around them creep into their religious observances. And they allowed those practices of the Greek world to pollute their very religious services. And they struggled to find unity. Does any of that sound familiar? Well, this church that Paul is writing to, in one of his more interesting letters, is in Corinth. The church is in this area that you see on the map here. And this is one of Paul's more entertaining letters because you'll notice as we read from it in a few moments, he's not in a great mood. You know, usually if you have a little blow up with someone, you're speaking to them face to face. If you take the time to sit down and write a long letter to someone and it still sounds that way, you know, you must really have, as the old guy in Texas used to say, a burr in your saddle. As you can see, Corinth is a seaport near ancient Greece. Corinth was one of the greatest trade destinations in the world in Paul's day. Ships and people from all over the world converged there. It was an economic center. It was a melting pot of all different kinds of goods and services and people and cultures. Many of those diverse people found their way into the church at Corinth Paul had established. As one might expect, the difficulties arose as these people began to live in community with one another. That's the backdrop for our lesson today as Paul addresses those issues. So let's start with our 2 Corinthians is where we are, if you want to turn there, and we're going to begin with the first 4 verses of the 11th chapter. And pay attention here to Paul's mood. It's quite striking. I wish you would put up with a little foolishness from me. Yes, do put up with me, for I'm jealous for you with a godly jealousy, because I've promised you in marriage to one husband, to present a virgin to Christ. But I fear that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your minds may be seduced from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if a person comes and preaches another Jesus whom we did not preach, or you receive a different spirit which you had not received, or a different gospel which you had not accepted, you put up with it splendidly. You can tell Paul has a beef with the church at Corinth. They've gotten his attention by some of the reports that had gotten back to him. He felt responsible for this church. Paul had lived in Corinth for a good period of time. He had a job during the day. He applied his trade, but he also set up the church. He worked, earned a wage to pay for his food and clothing and shelter, but then he spent the rest of his time as what we would call today a bivocational pastor, so to speak. Jews and Gentiles had come to live in a community and share the gospel, but problems soon arose as soon as Paul was away from their midst. If the early churches could be compared to children, and they were Paul's children, Corinth was the troublesome middle child, which is what I was growing up. Paul viewed the church as a bride he one day desired to give away to the groom being Jesus. His letter indicates that this particular bride had some work to do before she was presentable to the groom. He first addressed the purity, or lack thereof, of the Corinthians' faith. Many of them would worship with the church and then participate in idol worship with their friends away from their congregation, sort of like a modern-day Christian you hear about who is one way on Sunday and lives another way the rest of the week. So that was a problem for them. And others who were not holding on to every essential aspect of the gospel. In other words, they were picking and choosing which elements of the gospel that they wanted to follow and ignoring those that didn't really fit their lifestyle. He stressed that pillars of the faith like the resurrection, both of Jesus and believers in the last days, were essential and non-negotiable. Paul stressed that these believers should be holy and separate from the world, while not abandoning the world. In our world today, there are churches that don't look a whole lot different from the world around them. And at the same time, there are some religious sects that are so separate that they never engage with the world at large and are thus not able to really lead anyone to Christ or impact society. They have retreated from society. And you know what some of those religious denominations are. Paul was a model of how to strike a balance. He said at one point, "I've learned to become all things to all people so that I might save one." He knew that he couldn't disassociate himself from the world, but that he had to protect himself from the world so that it didn't tarnish his witness or dilute his message. And that's what the point that he's trying to get across to these folks in Corinth. Now, I can almost picture these people as this letter is read to them at one of their gatherings, and I imagine there are some frowns and some stern looks on some faces because he's about to step on their toes even more. Another reason for Paul's stern address to the Corinthians was the nature of their fellowship. Anytime you get a bunch of people from different backgrounds together, there are bound to be issues, and there were certainly some pretty bad issues in the church at Corinth. They had some immoral church members, people who more or less appreciated the community of being together in the church, and they appreciated the idea of having a fellowship, but they were immoral, and the people in the church were not calling them out on it. That's in 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 17, if you want to go back and look at that at some time. Some members were also suing one another. As I mentioned before, this is a highly industrialized, wealthy place, Corinth. And all of the people in this church had businesses of one type or another, and they took their internal disputes from the church body out into the courtrooms, or vice versa. Their external disputes with one another as they conducted business, they brought those into the church body, neither of which is a very good idea. They struggled to properly exercise their spiritual gifts. In another area, Paul had to address that. Paul believed that Christ was coming back very soon. He mentions it many times in his writings. So you can imagine the sense of urgency he felt. If he felt Jesus was coming back any day, how far off from being the bride he wanted to present to the groom was the church at Corinth. Now I'm going to read your fill in the blanks. You'll find them on page, you won't find them on the same page, but you know if you're in the lesson that is the fill in the blanks. I have a different book. But here we talk about this notion of the bride of Christ. We hear that a lot in the New Testament, and this is what they provide for you if you want to fill in your blanks. The church is described as the bride of Christ, faithfully waiting for the day when Christ will return and heaven and earth will be one, made up of all believers from all tongues and nations. The church is the bride that Christ redeemed. Finally, Paul was deeply concerned about the way the church had tolerated and even welcomed false teachers who preached a different Jesus than the real one. Now, we've mentioned in some of our previous lessons that false teachings were an issue in many of the early churches that Paul wrote to. He knew that the church's legs and endurance were only as good as the purity and simplicity of the message that they preached, and that they would have to hold fast to that message. And yet, I think maybe you'll find that the false teaching that Paul addresses in Corinth is even more insidious than it had been in some of the other places. They preached a faith that could not save. They preached a belief system that had been twisted and perverted to serve their own needs. Some other gospels like that exist in our day. He says they're preaching some other gospel. Do you ever wonder if we have people preaching some other gospel in our society today? Have you heard some? I bet you have. How about this one? It's your good works will get you to heaven. If you're a good person and do good things and you're charitable, that you should go to heaven. What about this one? All religions are pretty much the same, and there are many paths to God. Or this one, our real salvation comes in following our own hearts and our own minds and our own truth. All of these sound like those other gospels that Paul was so concerned about. And not only had they drifted into the fellowship at Corinth, but they've drifted into our society and have become dominant in many aspects of our society. Let's go to the next section of scriptures. If you'd like to turn to 2 Corinthians 11, verses 5 through 11, as Paul continues, and he's going to introduce a term here that you may find unusual to you, and it's the term super apostles, which on the surface sounds like a pretty good thing. We like superheroes in our culture. We go to see the movies where people have strengths and abilities beyond those of mortal men. But trust me, a super apostle, based on the way Paul describes them, is not something you'd like to be. Now, I consider myself in no way inferior to those super apostles. Even if I'm untrained in public speaking, I'm certainly not untrained in knowledge. Indeed, we have in every way made that clear to you in everything. Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by taking pay from them to minister to you. When I was present with you and in need, I did not burden anyone, since the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. I have kept myself and will keep myself from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows I do. Paul calls his opponents in the work at Corinth super apostles. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, Corinth, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, was a very sophisticated, large, educated city. It was a cultured city. Someone like Paul, who could hold his own in a public forum, we've seen him do that in other places like Mars Hill, but he was not a slick, professional preacher. They could be easily overshadowed by a Corinthian version of what we would know today as a televangelist. These people were a huge problem. They put their own spin on the gospel. They fostered a cult of personality. They lifted themselves up to the detriment of the gospel. Paul called himself the opposite of those people. He deliberately kept the message pure and simple so that it could impact more and more people, so that God's power, not Paul's power, would be the determining factor in changing people's lives. Though the culture of Corinth demanded that its speakers be eloquent and forceful, or you couldn't get an audience in Corinth, Paul took a different approach so that the message of God would shine through his presentation. In much the same way, we don't have to be professional speakers to share our faith. The message is the message, and it's a simple one, Paul says. The results should be and are up to God. What is prized more in our culture? Slickness, eloquence, and star power, or humility, knowledge, and truth? You would think Paul had walked right into the year 2021. Not a whole lot has changed since then. But the good news is that the remedy for that kind of thing, the protections, have not changed either, and they're still just as effective. The super apostles tried to twist Paul's motives to say he didn't care about the Corinthians because he refused to take money from them, as if they were beneath him. They considered this a weakness of Paul's ministry and a negative reflection on themselves. That's why he addressed that issue here. I don't think that there would be a church, in my experience, that would be offended if their pastor refused to take a salary from them. But this was evidently something that was an affront to the people in Corinth because they thought Paul was putting himself above them and looking down on them, which couldn't have been further from the truth. But as we know about these super apostles, and we'll know in the rest of this lesson, they're enemies of Christ. And they're minions of Satan, and they use lies and twist the truth to meet their own needs. All right, what do we do about these people that preach a false gospel? Now, there's some in our society that would say, well, just ignore them and they'll go away. That's been my experience, that doesn't really happen. And Paul certainly didn't believe that that was a good approach. Or maybe you just tolerate them, and maybe you just try to block out the parts of what they're teaching that you know to be contrary to the Scripture. Well, Paul didn't favor any of those approaches. Paul tells the church at Corinth that it is time for them to speak out against the false teachers, confront them, and root them out of their midst, as we look in chapter 11, verses 12 through 15. But I will continue to do what I'm doing, in order to deny an opportunity to those who want to be regarded as our equals in what they boast about. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no great surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will be according to their works. You know, Paul didn't see people that taught false teachings as an annoyance or an inconvenience, but he saw them as very active enemies of the gospel of Christ. And he said, they look like one of you. They look like one of us. They stand in a pulpit. They wear a suit. They have music. But listen to what they're saying, and if it's not biblical, you need to speak out against it. You know, Jesus said that in the last days, many people would say that they preached in his name, healed the sick in his name, etc., and that he would say he didn't know them and tell them to depart from him. These are the kind of pseudo-ministers Jesus must have been talking about. Now, up to this point, Paul's been pretty much sarcastic about the false teachers and he's been somewhat defensive of his own approach. You can tell that he's a little bit stung by some of the criticisms of the super apostles, but he knew that the Corinthians were gullible, and that's why he took that approach with them. They were what we would know today as pseudo-intellectual sheep. But his tone shifts as he identifies the true nature of false teachers here. He calls them minions of Satan, sent by him to trick us and lead us astray. That, he says, is serious business. Not only should we not follow them, but we should speak out against them. Why would they want to attack well-meaning Christians? Well, I can tell you throughout the history of denominational Christianity in this country and abroad, there have been several times throughout history where the people of God were on the very cusp of achieving something mighty for God's kingdom, where the prize was literally within reach in this denomination and in others. And one by one, those movements began to fall apart when people with ulterior motives began to get into positions of leadership, disputes over things like theology and practice of worship began to raise, and people began to split up, and the effectiveness of the entire movement, the entire church, was diluted and eventually diminished to the point where it was not really that effective at all. It's not something that's particularly native to our culture or our time. It was happening in Paul's day too, and he was doing everything he could to prevent it and to teach people how to run this kind of problem out of their midst. The church must examine her leaders. That's what Paul is saying here. Skills have their place, but knowledge of and commitment to the gospel are of utmost importance. God has never counted eloquence as a skill necessary to share his word. All the way back in the Old Testament, you remember when God faced Moses, and Moses tried to get out of his responsibilities that God was asking him to do by saying, well, I'm just not a good speaker. I stutter. I don't speak well. You should really choose someone else. God chooses the weak, the stutterer, the people who don't speak well for that very reason. For when the glory happens and the result is good, everyone knows that it was God and not the human being delivering the message. It's very important to note here that Paul refused to take money from those he was ministering to. I think that bears just a little bit more explanation before we close today. He wanted as much distinction between himself and the super apostles as possible, for they were greedy peddlers of the Word of God. If you can imagine this in your church or mine, paying an exorbitant fee to someone to come in with star power, TV cameras, and speak in your pulpit so that they could aggrandize themselves and leave you with all the problems that their twisted language created in your midst, that's the kind of situation that Paul was facing here. He did not care for the super apostles. Here's how I describe them in 2 Corinthians 2:17. I'm reading this from the Message because I think it packs a particular punch this way. No, at least we don't take God's word, water it down, and then take it to the streets to sell it cheap. We stand in Christ's presence when we speak. God looks at us in the face. We get what we say straight from God and say it as honestly as we can. If you want a prescription for how to be an effective communicator of the gospel, Paul has just given you one. Paul's last shot in this passage is a dire warning about what will eventually happen to the super apostles, and unfortunately, those who follow them and their teaching. It is critical to be able to distinguish between good teachers and bad. Ultimately, it's about what a teacher's end game is. Are they seeking to exalt themselves rather than Christ? Are they loving and humble, or are they angry and vengeful? Do they stick to the truth of the Scriptures, or do they use them as a jumping-off point to spin their own human philosophy? I doubt Paul would be surprised to see what is happening in our culture today. The Bible actually predicts that false teachers will multiply, not diminish, as the end times draw near. Our prayer should be, as it was with Paul, that we will continue to stand strong in our faith. Thank you for being with us this morning. I hope you'll stick around for the church service, which begins at 10:45. And until then, have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.
If you have a need or concern, please feel free to call us at 864-288-7835 or contact us through our website at maldenfirstbaptist.org.
This has been a video presentation of Malden First Baptist Church, Malden, South Carolina.